Welcome! In this particular video, we'll be solving trigonometric equations involving tangent part 2. Let's take a look at our first example. Example 1. Solve the equation given below for theta greater than or equal to 0 and less than 2 pi. Here our equation is tangent of negative 4 theta is equal to negative square root of 3 over 3. So let's start by defining a new variable. Let's call that new variable alpha. So let alpha be equal to negative 4 theta. Then this equation becomes tangent of alpha is equal to negative square root of 3 over 3. With that said, we need to figure out what are the alpha values that will make tangent equal to negative root 3 over 3. So by looking at this chart on the right, we can say, well, that the values for alpha that will make this a true statement happen to be 5 pi over 6. That's one of them. And the other one happens to be 11 pi over 6. But that's not the value that we're interested in. The value that we want to get is theta. So using the first value for alpha, in other words, using alpha equals 5 pi over 6, let's solve for theta. Well, alpha was defined to be negative 4 theta, so we can replace that with this here, and that is equal to 5 pi over 6. Now, dividing by negative 4 on both sides, we get that theta is equal to 5 pi over negative 24. However, this is not an angle on the particular interval of interest between 0 and 2 pi. So to get an angle on that particular interval, what we need to do is make use of the period. Now, the period of tangent is equal to pi. However, here we don't have tangent. What we have is tangent of negative 4 theta. So what we're going to do is take the original period of tangent of theta, and we're going to divide that by the absolute value of the coefficient of theta. In this case, let's divide that by the absolute value of negative 4. So that turns out to be pi over 4. That's your period for this function. So what we're going to do to find out what are the values for theta, we take this 5 pi over negative 24, and we're going to add the period of pi over 4. Now, this pi over 4 can be converted into pi times 6 over 4 times 6, so we can have the same denominator. And that is now 5 pi over negative 24 plus 6 pi over 24. So we get that theta is equal to pi over 24. That's our first value there. Now, to figure out what are the other values of theta, we just take this new angle and we're going to keep adding the period. So we have our next theta is pi over 24 plus pi over 4. Now, since we want the same denominator, let me multiply this by 6 over 6. So this is now pi over 24 plus 6 pi over 24, which happens to be 7 pi over 24. Now that's another angle that works for us. So now, to figure out the next angle, we take this previous angle, which is 7 pi over 24, and we're going to add the period of pi over 4. Now, let me multiply this one by 6 over 6 so we can have the same denominator, and this now becomes 7 pi over 24 plus 6 pi over 24. And that is now 13 pi over 24. So that also works. Now, we can take that one again, and we can say, well, we have theta that is equal to 13 pi over 24 plus pi over 4. Now, let's multiply this one by 6 over 6, and we get that this is 13 pi. Don't forget my pi here. Okay, so 13 pi over 24 plus 6 pi over 24. and that gives us 19 pi over 24. And that's still less than the so-called 2 pi. Why? How do we know that? Well, because 2 pi is equal to, if we want to leave it in terms of 24s, we can say that this is just 2 pi times 24 over 24. Okay, which turns out to be 48 pi over 24. So as long as our angle is less than 48 pi over 24 and greater than or equal to 0, we're good. So to figure out the next theta, what we do is we take this 19 pi over 24 and we're going to add the period of this value, pi over 4. But let's get the same denominator, so let's multiply that by 6 over 6. So this now becomes 19 pi over 24 plus 6 pi over 24. And that is now 25 pi over 24. Now let's add that angle to the period one more time. So we have 25 pi over 24 plus the pi over 4, which is the period. Let's multiply that by 6 over 6 to get the same denominator. And this is now 25 pi over 24 plus 6 pi over 24, which gives you 31 pi over 24. Now the next one will be 31 pi over 24 plus the period of pi over 4. Again, let's multiply this one by 6 over 6 to get the same denominator. So this is 31 pi over 24 plus 6 pi over 24. And that gives you the 37 pi over 24. Now, let's try one more here. So we have theta is equal to 37 pi over 24 plus the period of pi over 4. Again, let's multiply this one by 6 over 6 to get the same denominator. So this is now 37 pi over 24 plus 6 pi over 24. And that gives you 43 pi over 24. Now, if we were to add one more, let's say we add another 6 pi over here over 24, that will become 49 pi over 24, which is past the 48 pi over 24 that represents the 2 pi. So let's see how many solutions we have obtained so far. So we have the 43 pi over 24, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 solutions so far, 6, 7, and one more, 8. Now, that was because we actually found the first theta, or the first alpha here. Now, if we were to take the next alpha, for alpha equals to 11 pi over 6, we can actually add, or we can actually solve for theta. So solve for theta. And we notice that this is just negative 4 theta is equal to 11 pi over 6. Now, divided by negative 4 on both sides, we get that theta is equal to 11 pi over negative 24. Now, we need to add the period again to this one, so we get that theta is equal to 11 pi over negative 24 plus the pi over 4. Now, in order for us to get the same denominator, let's multiply this one by 6 over 6. So we get 11 pi over negative 24 plus the 6 pi over the 24, which now becomes negative 5 pi over 24. Still, not between 0 and 2 pi. So we are going to keep adding the period here. So we have theta is equal to negative 5 pi over 24 plus pi over 4, which is a period. Now let's multiply this one by 6 over 6 to get the same denominator, and we get negative 5 pi over 24 plus 6 pi over 24, which gives you pi over 24. Now notice that this particular value is exactly the same value that we got previously for this theta, the original theta that, or the very first theta that was positive there. So if we were to repeat the same process, we're going to get exactly the same outcomes here, or the same solutions. So we don't have to repeat that. We can just say that in general, these are the actual solutions to our particular equation. We can say, well, in this case, our solutions happen to be 43 pi over 24, 7 pi over 24, 13 pi over 24, 19 pi over 24, 25 pi over 24, 31 pi over 24, 37 pi over 24, and lastly but not least, pi over 24. So this concludes our example on how to solve trigonometric equations with tangent part 2. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.